There is a field that has no fences. It floods every spring, and no one plants it. The food grows on its own, taller than a person, swaying over water too deep to stand in. And for thousands of years, the only way to harvest it was to climb into a small boat and beat the plants with a stick until they rained their grain into your lap. That field still exists. The technique still works. And it may be one of the oldest food-gathering methods on Earth that never became farming, even though it easily could have. Picture the place first. Late summer, somewhere in the cold lake country of what is now the upper Midwest of North America. The water is shallow and dark, threaded with the stems of a tall aquatic grass. Its scientific name is zizania, but the people who have harvested it for countless generations call it Manoomin, which in the Anishinaabe language means the good berry or the good grain. To you, it would look like a sea of green and gold reeds growing straight out of the lake. To them it was a grocery store, a calendar, and a sacred trust all in one. Here is how the harvest worked, and it is stranger than anything a modern farm would recognize. Two people share a narrow canoe. One stands or kneels at the back and pushes the boat forward with a long forked pole, sliding it slowly through the standing grass. The other sits in the middle, holding two smooth wooden sticks, often carved from cedar, each about the length of a forearm. These sticks have a name. They are called knockers. With one stick, the harvester bends a cluster of the tall grass gently over the boat. With the other, they tap the seed heads. Not a hard strike. A flick, and the ripe grains, the ones ready to let go, fall loose and patter down into the bottom of the canoe like a soft rain. Bend, tap, release. Bend, tap, release. All day, across acres of water, a quiet rhythm older than most written languages. Now, why is that crazy? Because at first, it sounds inefficient. You are not pulling up the plant. You are not cutting it down. You are not even taking most of what is there. And that is exactly the point. The grains that are not quite ripe stay on the stem. The grains that fall outside the canoe drop into the water and sink into the mud where they will sprout next year. The harvester is taking only the portion the plant is already prepared to give. Everything else is left to reseed the lake. It is a harvest designed deliberately to never empty the field. Think about how counterintuitive that is. The entire logic of farming, the logic that would eventually reshape the planet, is about control. You clear the land. You choose the seed. You plant in rows. You fight back everything that is not your crop. But the people in that canoe did the opposite. They let the wild grass grow where it wanted, on its own schedule, and they shaped their entire lives around its timing instead of forcing it to obey theirs. They did not domesticate the plant. They domesticated themselves to the plant. And the archaeology suggests this kind of relationship is genuinely ancient. To understand how old wild grain gathering really is, you have to travel to the other side of the world, to the Yangtze River Valley in China. There, archaeobotanists, scientists who study the remains of ancient plants, have been digging into the very origins of rice itself. At a waterlogged site called Shangshan, researchers have found evidence of people interacting with wild rice more than 10,000 years ago. At a nearby site called Tianluoshan, the archaeobotanist Dorian Fuller and his colleagues studied thousands of tiny rice remains layer by layer, and they found something remarkable. Domestication did not happen in a flash. It crawled. Over more than 1,000 years, the proportion of rice with tough, non-shattering stems, the kind that holds its grain instead of dropping it, slowly crept upward. For a very long stretch, people were harvesting wild and half-wild rice that still scattered its own seed, exactly the way that lake grass in North America still does today. So what you are looking at in that canoe is not a primitive failure to invent farming. It is a window into the long, blurry threshold that every grain crop on Earth once passed through. A threshold that, in the cold northern lakes, was never crossed at all. Why not? Why did wild rice in North America stay wild, while wild rice in Asia became the staple that feeds half the world? The answer is humbling. The lake grass never needed to change because the people never needed it to. The harvest was abundant. A skilled pair in a canoe could gather enough in a few good autumn days to help carry a family through winter. The grain stored well. It grew back on its own. There was simply no pressure to clear fields, build dikes, or breed a tamer plant, when the lake already produced more than enough and asked for nothing in return but respect and restraint. Sometimes the most sophisticated technology is the decision not to take everything. And this fits a much larger pattern that anthropologists have spent decades uncovering. For most of human history, the people we casually label hunter-gatherers were not living on the ragged edge of starvation. The anthropologist Richard Lee, studying the Juhansi people of the Kalahari Desert in the 1960s, made a finding that stunned his field. These foragers were getting plenty to eat while working surprisingly few hours, leaving long stretches of the day for rest, visiting, and talk. James Suzman, who lived among and wrote about the same southern African communities decades later, described a society wired for what he called immediate return living, taking what the land offered today and trusting it to offer again tomorrow, rather than hoarding and grinding without end. That is the same quiet confidence you can see in the rhythm of the knocking sticks. Take what is ripe. Leave the rest. Come back next year. Now picture the scene completely. The morning mist is still lifting off the lake. The water is cold enough to numb your fingers. The canoe slides almost silently between the towering stems, and the only sounds are the drip of the pole, the rustle of the grass parting, and that soft, endless patter of grain falling into the hull. By midday, the bottom of the boat is filling with a green-gold heap, still damp, still alive. There is no machinery. No engine, no marketplace in sight. Just two people, a boat, two sticks, and a relationship with a plant that stretches back further than anyone in that canoe could possibly count. And then comes the part that turns the whole story over. Because that grain in the bottom of the boat is not finished. It is not food yet. The truly ingenious work happens back on shore, and it is a kind of controlled transformation that took enormous skill to master. The freshly knocked grain has to be cured, dried slowly so it does not rot. Then it has to be parched, roasted carefully over a fire to loosen the tough outer husk without burning the kernel inside. Then comes the strangest step of all. The roasted grain is placed in a pit or a tub, and a person steps in and dances on it, wearing clean moccasins, treading in a slow rhythm to rub the husks free without crushing the grain. This dance even has a name in some communities. And finally, the grain is tossed in the air in wide flat baskets, so the wind can carry away the loose chaff and leave only the clean, dark, nutty kernels behind. Stop and consider what that means. The hardest, most clever part of the entire process was never the gathering. It was knowing the plant so completely across every stage of its life and death that you could turn a fistful of wild lake seed into a food that would keep for months. That is not the absence of technology. That is technology measured in generations of accumulated knowledge, passed hand to hand, with no written manual at all. Now turn that lens around and point it at your own life. You live, almost certainly, in a world built on the opposite instinct. Take the most, store the most. Optimize, extract, scale, and never leave grain in the water if you can possibly knock it into the boat. Your calendar is not set by when a plant is ready to release its seed. It is set by alarms and deadlines and the assumption that more is always better. And yet some part of you already knows the older arithmetic. You know the meal you slowed down to make taste different from the one you rushed. You know the work you did with restraint outlasts the work you did with greed. You know that taking only what is ripe and leaving the rest to grow back is not weakness. It is the longest game there is. The people in that canoe were not poorer than you because they refused to strip the lake bare. They were richer in the one currency that actually compounds, which is a place that still feeds you next year and the year after and 100 years after that. They built a food system with no fences, no fertilizer, and no waste, and it lasted for thousands of years precisely because it never tried to win. So go back to that field with no fences, the one that floods every spring, where the food grows on its own and no one plants it. It was never a sign that your ancestors had not yet figured out farming. It was a sign that some of them had figured out something farming would spend the next 10,000 years forgetting. The craziest way ancient humans ever gathered grain was not crazy at all. It was the sanest bargain anyone ever made with the living world, sealed with 2 cedar sticks, and the wisdom to stop knocking before the lake ran out.